Thank you so much for staying with us here on Morning Live. Now, there's a fierce debate raging on the Reserve Bank's mandate and whether it should be expanded upon or not. Now, there have been contradictory statements coming from the ANC. Its Secretary-General Ace Magashule said that the party had agreed to change the bank's mandate to include economic growth and employment. But the ANC's head of economic transformation, Enoch Godongwana, has disputed that. Finance Minister Tito Mboweni also weighed in, rubbishing Magashule's comments. So to discuss this further, we're joined now here in studio by Dr Anthea Jeffery, who's head of policy research at the Institute for Race Relations. And on the line, we have SACP National Spokesperson Alex Mashilo joining us. And thanks to both of you for coming through this morning. Now, I want to start here. What is the Reserve Bank mandate for those who do not know it, and why is it so important that it remains independent? I'm going to start with you, Dr. Jeffery.
According to the Constitution, the Reserve Bank mandate is to essentially maintain the value of the currency in the interests of balanced and sustainable growth. And the Reserve Bank Governor, the Secretary-General, has very frequently explained how important that is. That if you have inflation expanding out of control, which could happen if the Reserve Bank mandate were to change, then first of all the poor would suffer most of all from rising prices, but also it would be much more difficult to attract the investment and to generate the growth that we need. So he believes that the most effective way for the Reserve Bank in fact to contribute to employment and growth is to maintain the current focus, as the Constitution puts it, which is a fairly flexible mandate, but does have the emphasis on inflation targeting rather than on attempts by the bank to generate growth, when growth can really only come in other ways, from changing microeconomic policies that would help to boost confidence in the economy.
So given that very clearly constitutionally defined mandate, what are some of the arguments or objections to expanding the mandate of the Reserve Bank?
Well, it's a very slippery slope. It's a dangerous thing to do, particularly for a country in our kind of very negative economic situation. It would be an attempt at a quick fix. Again, as Mr. Kanyaka has said, that if you lower interest rates, if you have an increased money supply, in essence printing more money, there will, for a short period, be some sort of mini boom in which more jobs are created, and there may be a sense that we've solved the economic problems. But he says that that gain is always short term, and people don't like it when the long-term pain shows up, which he says is usually about 2 years after you embark on such a policy. And then you can really get into a situation such as Zimbabwe is in, where you have inflation spiraling far out of control, or Venezuela, where it's reached over 1 million%. And people are utterly desperate because there are no goods in the shops. They're having to flee because there are no jobs. There is almost nothing to buy with your very rapidly deteriorating money.
Well, Alex Mashilo, if you could just perhaps weigh in on this as well, with regard to the expansion of that mandate and what the likely consequences of that could be. You've heard Dr. Jeffery expressing why one shouldn't necessarily be tempted to basically alter that particular mandate. But what's your view as the SACP?
Let me start with what Dr. Jeffery has said. The Constitution also clearly says the powers and functions of the South African Reserve Bank as the Central Bank of South Africa shall be determined through an Act of Parliament and must be exercised in terms of the conditions set in that Act. So clearly the Constitution does not start and stop where Dr. Jeffery left it. In addition, when we went out to campaign as African National Congress and the Alliance, the SACP, COSATU and SAMCO, we said in the manifesto that in its conduct of monetary policy, the Reserve Bank has to take into account employment creation. The ANC received a mandate to that extent. This is the time for us to implement what we are saying in the manifesto. I must say that the South African Reserve Bank, if its mandate explicitly includes employment growth, would not be the first central bank on earth to focus on employment growth. The Federal Reserve in the United States of America, in fact, has even more radical mandate. That is to ensure maximum employment. So this thing is not wrong, it is right. Some other people only agree with you when you show them that it is happening in the United States, the epicenter of the world capitalist system. I wish I would debate with Dr. Jeffery what she said about Venezuela. Unfortunately, we do not have time, and that is not the focus of our discussion at the present moment.
Well, it isn't, but perhaps we could just briefly engage on that, because Dr. Jeffery, you say that one of the unintended consequences perhaps of altering this particular mandate could be that we follow the route of a Venezuela or even a Zimbabwe more closer to home. So again, if we can just engage on that, because people listening to that may think, well, this is not a good idea. Why do you think we would go that route?
Because we can see the experience of it, and I think perhaps Zimbabwe is the best example. And it was also very much linked to their use of expropriation without compensation to take land from people, because that so eroded property rights that it really crippled the economy and any prospect of investment, and it saw a great diminution in growth. But because you also had to keep paying government servants and so on, there was a temptation, and what happened was that the Reserve Bank really effectively started printing money so as to give the government the capacity to keep on paying its bills. And with more money coming in than there was goods to absorb that money, as it were, you got a spiral of inflation, and it soon went right out of control. We can recall the vast sorts of rates of inflation that were evident in Zimbabwe and how much suffering that entailed to all the people there. Those lucky enough to have savings had them wiped out. The poor with no savings but still needing to buy goods in the shops found that they simply couldn't afford them because the price of bread went up enormously, and whatever you were able to obtain by way of earnings or in other ways simply wasn't enough to pay for the price that was leaping up every single day.
So that, of course, I would imagine would be enough to scare quite a number of people, Alex. So you say South Africa is unlikely to go that route?
South Africa will not go that route. I don't know whether Dr. Jeffery has been in Venezuela. I have been in Venezuela. Venezuela has been facing sanctions from the United States of America. Imports to Venezuela were blocked, especially in the consumer sector, which is why there has been no supply of goods and other services into Venezuela because of the sanctions. South Africa is not under sanctions. What we want in terms of what the Reserve Bank should do, and Tito Mboweni has argued that this is already being done. What we want is that the mandate must explicitly include employment growth. This could be achieved through moderate long-term interest rates. When interest rates are moderately low, particularly long-term interest rates, but this also includes a dual interest rate structure between both long-term and short-term interest rates and between productive investment and loans for consumption. When you have moderately long-term low interest rates, you are able to motivate people to borrow money, to invest in the economy, and investment in the economy will induce demand, leading to people buying, and then that will result in expansion of productive activity as well as employment. We should not live with the status quo that we have, because what Dr. Jeffery said, that in exercising its powers and functions, the Reserve Bank must do so in the interest of balanced and sustainable growth. We can say that constitutional provision has not been observed because South Africa has very high levels of unemployment. Over 9.8 million South Africans, in terms of the expanded definition of unemployment, are unemployed. There are high levels of class inequalities. Poverty is entrenched. Those three indicators have got nothing to do with a balanced and sustainable growth. This means that the Reserve Bank has not been performing well. And of course, you cannot judge the Reserve Bank only, while we have many other institutions that have got to play their part to ensure that we radically reduce unemployment in this country.
All right, and coming back to the whole issue of the ANC and the contradictory statements emanating from the party, some are viewing this as perhaps the surest indication yet, Dr. Jeffery, of the ANC looking to change the ownership of the Reserve Bank. What's your take on that?
Sorry, if I could just respond very briefly first to what was said on Venezuela. It's not US sanctions that have caused so much difficulty there. It's been the erosion of property rights by Hugo Chavez and now by his successor. And price controls which have actually made it uneconomic to produce goods. And this is what has sparked off this economic malaise, which is now reflected also in hyperinflation. And if we want to obtain growth creation, obviously we must have more jobs in the country. There are many other policies which need to be tackled. It's not because of the mandate of the Reserve Bank that we have nearly 10 million unemployed. It's because we've made so many other policy missteps. We have labor laws which are too coercive and unreasonable. We have BEE as a massive tax on business in addition to our quite high corporate tax rate. There are very much better means of trying to empower the disadvantaged than BEE, which helps only a small number and leaves out the great majority and is becoming an increasing factor in unemployment because it has deterred investment. We also have the ESCOM problem. We have inefficiency in the public service. There are so many factors outside the macroeconomic one where we really need to embark on proper reforms in order to generate confidence and growth and jobs, and we must get our education right. All these things must be tackled, and unless we do, we can change if we change the mandate of the Reserve Bank, it's not going to make much difference to our capacity to generate jobs. If anything, it will do what Mr. Kanyaka warned. It may generate a short-term sense of some kind of boom because interest rates are artificially low, but the long term will show up. The negative consequences of engaging in that kind of policy will come back to bite us. And then we will have all the sorts of problems that I've already identified, plus a high rate of inflation, plus a further loss of confidence in South Africa's capacity to manage its economy. And then it will be even harder to get back towards the kind of new dawn that President Ramaphosa has been promising us.
So just for clarity's sake, what exactly would you be opposed to with regard to expansion or even a change in ownership of the Reserve Bank? What exactly are you opposed to?
That it's completely unnecessary because the 650 private shareholders that the bank has have absolutely no impact on monetary policy. They also obtain very limited dividends from the bank. And it really seems an unnecessary red herring, given all the other problems that we're facing, to concentrate on buying out or in some way expropriating the stakeholdings of those few people. The mandate is set in other ways by the governor in terms of the Constitution, in consultation with the National Treasury. Getting rid of the shareholders does nothing, but it does seem to signal, as Mr. Kanyaka has warned, that the state wants to exercise more control over an institution, which needs to be independent, whose independence is critically important if we're to retain credibility in the outside world and bring in the additional investment that we so badly need.
Alex Mashilo?
Look, the focus now is on, and let me clarify this because we do not need to have any further miscommunication. The ANC, Lekgotla, and the Alliance are not saying the mandate of the Reserve Bank must be changed. We want the Reserve Bank to explicitly focus also, in addition to protecting the value of our currency, on employment growth. The Reserve Bank is a key institution in our economy. It manages our monetary policy, and how you manage that is critical and has influence on employment, which we need to radically reduce. That is significant. And over and above that, by the way, the Constitution does not recognize any policy independence for the Reserve Bank. It recognizes operational independence, and as the SACP, we wholeheartedly support that. But Parliament has a role to play to ensure that the Reserve Bank participates in the problems that we have as a country in order to solve these problems.
Well, we are going to have to leave it there. Of course, a debate that will rage on for some time to come. Dr. Anthea Jeffery, Head of Policy Research at the Institute for Race Relations and the South African Communist Party's Alex Mashilo, weighing in on the independence of the Reserve Bank following comments made by ANC ministers and, of course, some of the leadership in that particular party. And that's our question of the day as well, asking you whether you believe that the mandate should be expanded upon, should it be changed, and why you believe this to be the case. And of course, after listening to these arguments, I'm sure you'll be telling us a lot more of your views on this particular matter. But right now, it's time for the latest news.